In the 1960s and 70s, critical pedagogy, or critical education, was all the rage. Fundamentally, it took the view that the role of education should be to emancipate people from oppression. That is, to awaken them to the harsh reality of their social conditions and to give them the intellectual tools to free themselves from it. Pedagogy, meaning essentially the art of teaching, and the critical element involving inviting the learners into the learning process rather than simply teaching at them, engaging them in dialogue about what they're learning and asking them to interrogate received wisdom rather than simply accepting it. In so doing, its proponents argued, learners would ascend to a new level of critical consciousness. They would see the world more clearly and thus be able to tackle its problems, remedy its injustices, make it a better place. Unfortunately, schools in reality were not doing that. In fact, they were partly responsible for the oppression. Critical pedagogy grew out of something called the Frankfurt School in the 1920s and 30s, notably in Germany and the USA. This was a school of thought which viewed society from the position of the marginalised and which committed itself to their emancipation through taking aim at the dominant ideology, the system of norms and beliefs put about by the ruling classes, maintained and reproduced through various sinister instruments, including schools. Perhaps the most famous text in the story of critical pedagogy was this one, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, published in 1968. Freire was a Brazilian educator and activist, an inspiring man, and Pedagogy is a biblical text for a lot of people involved in thinking about education. And it's an amazing book. It's written with huge heart and it really made me think. At its core, it lays out two competing models of education. The first one Freire calls the banking model, essentially the version of education used in almost every school all over the world. This approach, he says, sees the students as empty receptacles into which knowledge must be deposited or banked. The students arrive at the school empty, they sit in rows obediently and passively receive the knowledge from the authority figure at the front. The curriculum is just a series of deposits to be banked rather than as problems to be tackled. And the student's prerogative is simply to receive, memorise and repeat. The world is cut up into different subjects, into different specifications, neatly compartmentalised, packaged and delivered to the student. This bit of knowledge separate to that bit of knowledge. In fact, it doesn't even go by the word knowledge these days, but by content, much like the content you're seeing right now on YouTube. Stuff, a product, a commodity. And the banking model, says Freire, is a terrible way of teaching. Rather than awakening students' minds, it crushes them. It has an overwhelming capacity, he says, to annul the students' creative power and to stimulate their credulity, inducing compliance to the system, acceptance of reality as it's given to them, and alienation from the world as it really is. And that's exactly what its perpetrators want, whether they admit to it or not. Individuals who do not question the world but simply accept it, who can only see it in its parts rather than as a whole. Even if they know deep down that they're being screwed over, they're so cowed by the system, so lacking in imagination and schooled in compliance, that they couldn't change it even if they wanted to. Perfect little drones, says Freire, for the assembly line of capital. And yes, it should come as no surprise that he was very much an out-and-out Marxist. And with the banking model, if that wasn't bad enough, it's not just the students, but also the teachers who are alienated from the gnoseological process, the process of really knowing something, of really understanding the world. After all, most teachers don't think they're training their students in mindless compliance, nor probably do the people that design the curriculum or the leaders who make the policy. These people all talk about education in terms of empowerment, opportunity, social mobility, and I think they really mean it. But unfortunately, the banking model is so pervasive, we've all become trapped within it, all just a part of the machine, unable to see it as problematic or harmful. After all, the teachers and the legislators and the parents all went through the same system. They go on, Freire says, to repeat the rigid patterns in which they were miseducated. And while he does acknowledge the superficial use value in students receiving and filing their curriculum deposits, they do, after all, use their knowledge and skills to go and get jobs and earn money. Ultimately, he says, it is the people themselves who are filed away through the lack of creativity, transformation, and knowledge by this misguided system. In short, they're denied the chance to be fully human. And on one level, he's absolutely right. The banking model certainly is used in most countries. In the UK, we have an incredibly content-heavy national curriculum, first designed by Kenneth Baker in the late 1980s. Its mandate is the delivery of content, not the awakening of young minds. It is characterised by the conveyance of many thousands of facts, separate, disconnected, assessed in ticks and crosses. When called upon to regurgitate learned content from memory in exams under extremely stressful conditions, note, the words and formulae are defined in the students' minds by their connection to the mark scheme rather than by what they symbolise in reality, and so are stripped of their connection to the real world. How often do well-meaning teachers go out of their way trying to bring the curriculum to life, to make it real and tangible for their students, like Dr. Frankenstein trying to animate a corpse? Within this model, Freire claims, the student is compelled to apprehend reality at a distance, as if it were a set of static abstractions, rather than to exist with the world and to engage with it, with a critical mind. Recent UK governments, terrified of trendy left-wing teachers, doubled down on this content-heavy, fact-driven approach, with detailed prescriptions down to lists of spelling in core subjects, and a preference for traditional, direct instruction. Everything Paulo Freire feared. But Freire had an alternative. He called it the problem-posing model. This presented education as a co-exploration between teacher and student, aiming to understand the world as being a process undergoing constant transformation, a continuous problem to be tackled. Fundamentally, problem-posing education is dialogue-based, rather than a matter of one-way delivery. It breaks the hierarchical teacher-student relationship and repositions the teacher as no longer merely the one who teaches, but who is himself taught in dialogue with the students. Dialogue is most definitely the wheel on which critical education turns, an existential necessity, Freire says, which allows the teacher and students to set about cracking open the world, demythologizing it. Through dialogue, Freire's problem-posing model invites the students democratically into their own learning, giving them a degree of ownership over it and incorporating their own experiences, rather than simply memorizing and regurgitating content. The students, rather than being docile listeners, are now critical co-investigators in dialogue with the teacher. And they're much better placed to see the world for the mess it really is and to transform it into something better. And we know the crucial importance of dialogue, of talking in education. Research shows that students learn best and really engage with their learning when teachers engage in strategies of systematic interrogation of pupil understanding. Furthermore, we've seen that dialogue is as crucial for the teacher as it is for the students, in that one's understanding of a knowledge domain is actualized or even grasped fully for the first time by the very act of attempting to communicate. The national curriculum, however, packed full of content, puts immense pressure on teachers to get through the course and thus ensures what Derry calls an economy of interaction, choking opportunities for rich and open conversation, strangling any attempt to truly understand the world. Modern progressive education took on board much of Freire's worldview. Progressive education has two main approaches: child-centred education and social reconstructionism. Child-centred education represents a conscious move away from the banking model, basing the learning more on projects and experience and inquiry, attempting to give children the freedom to develop more naturally, making what they learn less abstract and artificial. While social reconstructionism focuses on a curriculum that emphasises the need for social reform, to transform society through education. Of course, progressive education and critical pedagogy are not exactly the same thing. Critical pedagogy is black and white in that the system is unjust and the majority of learners are oppressed and in need of liberating. Progressive education is softer, but it still maintains the world is in need of reform, that it could be a better place. And education is the means of unlocking this vision. So this all sounds pretty good, right? What's the problem? Well, it's in the title of the book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It sees the students in a certain way before they've even reached the classroom. It groups them together as marginalised unfortunates, with the teacher as liberator. See, critical pedagogy and progressive education in general suffers from a major contradiction at its centre. On the one hand, it purports to make the students into autonomous, critical beings who are able to see and critique the world objectively. It aims to invite students and teachers into curious co-exploration. But on the other hand, it tells them, the world is like this, and you will come to see it that way. You are oppressed, and you will see yourself that way. You will then transform the world and yourself into something better. That something better is prescribed by us. And if you don't, you're wrong. You see, critical education is at its heart teleological. It's driven by a utopian vision of the future and a critical view of the present. And it wants to lead its students into that future. And that's a big problem, because that's not critical consciousness. Teaching ideologically is the negation of critical consciousness. I hate to say it, but it's kind of indoctrination. And look, Freire doesn't hide the fact that he's a Marxist and that's his worldview. The main cameos in his writings are Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, with Che as a sort of folk hero who is incapable of doing anything wrong. At least he's upfront about it. But progressive education adopted a lot of Freire's thinking. And you can't on the one hand claim you're trying to awaken young minds, while on the other hand being prescriptive in your vision of the world. It's a false promise, said the Israeli educationalist Ilan Gurzev, which in fact inhibits any genuine struggle for the autonomy of the individual. In fact, the ultimate irony is that it's just another version of the banking model. We want you to bank our ideology, to accept that you're oppressed, to accept that the world is in need of revolutionary change. And the trouble is, even if you pedal softly and say, well, let's be progressive but not prescriptive in our teaching, let's engage in some soft social reconstructionism. We won't dictate a fixed end goal for society, but we will say the world is clearly in need of reform and it's up to you, the students, to reform it in whatever way you see fit. Well, different students are going to have different visions of what the world should look like. And many aren't going to agree that the world is in need of reform or that they're oppressed in the first place. And here we arrive at the age-old problem with much of the progressive thinking that has its roots in, I don't want a dog whistle here because I'm quite left-wing, but that has its roots in Marxism. That is, it wants its subjects to become critically aware, but only as long as they become critically aware of the correct thing. Essentially, it's the wake-up sheeple problem. Wake up, but only to what I say you should wake up to. Of course, if the so-called oppressed disagree with you, if they say, I'm not oppressed, the world is fine as it is. In fact, it contains within it the means of my advancement. It's why I'm at school. Well, then bless their little cotton socks. They're just victims of, wait for it, false consciousness. They just haven't quite got it yet. They'll learn one day. Or maybe not. Now, to be fair, Freire and co. do deal with this. He says very clearly, those who are culturally invaded, that is, indoctrinated, rarely go beyond the models which the invaders prescribe for them. Ask students what they want, and many will say they want to be rich, they want to be a CEO, they want to do a gap year and then go to uni, become a corporate lawyer or a consultant doctor. It's all very humdrum, all very compliant. They often believe very firmly that social mobility is a positive feature of the system, that some will stay poor and some will get rich and that that's okay, and that schools as they are have the power to enable them. Now, I'm not here to say whether I think that's true or false. But what should the problem-posing educator do when confronted with these beliefs, this false consciousness, as it were? Okay, Freire says, don't dismiss these beliefs, recognise them as valid, but also reflect them back to the students as essentially the products of indoctrination. Get them to realise that the very structure of their thought has been conditioned by the situation by which they were shaped. And that's a problem. The teacher isn't teaching, but is rather preaching from a pulpit. She doesn't want her students to be critically autonomous, but rather just to be a different kind of sheeple. Sheep-person? Freire even says the role of the teacher is to convince and convert, something that has religious overtones. And you can't argue with religion. In a way, critical education is worse because it pretends to be something it isn't. It pretends to be a model of teaching designed to cultivate genuine intellectual autonomy, when really what it wants is just another form of submission. At least the banking model, for all its problems, doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. It says, here's some knowledge, learn it. Hannah Arendt was a German Jew born in 1906. She was imprisoned by the Gestapo in the 1930s, detained in France by the Nazis, before ultimately fleeing to New York in 1941, narrowly escaping genocide. In 1951, she published The Origins of Totalitarianism, analysing the rise of Europe's dictators and the awesome power of indoctrination. Other works include Eichmann in Jerusalem, an insight into the mind of a rather ordinary man, Adolf Eichmann, and the system that allowed him to carry out unspeakable evil, organising the Holocaust. Hannah Arendt knew perhaps more than anyone what it meant to be caught up in an ideology, how easy it can be to manipulate people into believing certain things. In 1958, 10 years before the publication of Freire's book, Arendt wrote an essay called The Crisis in Education. She argued that education in America had lost its way. Teachers started to see themselves as ideologues, agents of social and political change, rather than as educators, dedicated to transmitting knowledge and fostering intellectual growth. She argued that this shift undermined the true purpose of education and warned that it was prioritising indoctrination over critical inquiry, stifling the diversity of thought essential to intellectual and cultural renewal. This approach, Arendt said, sacrifices the sanctity of education as a space where students can explore knowledge freely, guided by authority rather than coercion. A teacher, said Arendt, needs fundamentally to have made peace with the world, or at least to have left their disquiet at the door. They are custodians of the world's cultural heritage, not activists, and their role is to introduce students to this shared inheritance and to help them understand and engage with it critically. The teacher represents the world as it is, she said, not because it is good, but because it is the world. If they abandon this role in favour of promoting political agendas, this is a grotesque distortion of education, reducing it to a means of social engineering rather than a process of intellectual development. Teachers shouldn't be afraid to be the authority, and they must bear some responsibility not just for the students, but for the world itself. Crucially, said Arendt, children should be shielded from the demands of the adult world, including its ideological conflicts, during their formative years. The aim in the end is to enable the child to become something new, something unforeseen, not something prescribed by those who know better. Now, this is a very different line of thinking to that of Freire and the progressives. And it's ironic, given that many educators she was talking about saw themselves as post-war progressives, aimed at positive social reconstruction, not the horrendous fascism from which Hannah Arendt had escaped. But it didn't matter, she said. Indoctrination is indoctrination. It doesn't matter whether it's from the left or the right. Schools are not ideological laboratories. The proper role of teachers is not to mould students into adherents of a cause, but to equip them with the tools to think critically and to act responsibly in the world, and to grow into something new. But yeah, there's ideology here too. Teachers who see themselves as the custodians of heritage are implicitly kind of endorsing the world as it is. But what Arendt is right about is that the goal of education should not be explicitly political, aimed at some utopian vision. Maybe to say the goal is critical inquiry and intellectual autonomy is political in a way. It's individualistic. But at least if this is your goal, you're not imposing anything onto the student. You're leaving them free to craft their own vision and giving them the tools to do so. So where do we go from here? On the one hand, a superficial reading of Hannah Arendt all sounds a bit Catherine Birbal-Singh in the Michaela Academy, tradition, authority. On the other hand, a clumsy handling of critical pedagogy is just indoctrination by stealth. But Arendt doesn't just say, preserve tradition, promote authority. She says, take some responsibility for the world, but give the child the means to become something new, something unforeseen. She's not a radical traditionalist. What the teacher needs to do is to contextualize the world for the student, but also to allow their education to be transformative. They do have to inherit the world, but they also do have to renew it. And the thing we can't get away from is that Freire is absolutely right. The banking model is hugely problematic. It's dull, it's alienating, it compartmentalizes reality, and it turns the world into an abstraction. It treats the students as passive consumers, not active explorers. This obsession with content, it's a word I hear every day as a teacher, really brings home the sort of static, commodified nature of contemporary teaching. Education as a product, not as a process. And here's the big thing, most students don't seem to like it. For example, a 2004 study carried out by the New Economics Foundation, which questioned 1,000 children aged 7 to 19 across 6 schools, found that happiness levels slump dramatically as students climb from primary to secondary education. According to the report, only 27% of secondary school students claim to enjoy their education, with only 12% agreeing with the statement, school is interesting. The report concluded that overall, secondary school children seem to become bored, stop learning, and no longer enjoy the activities associated with school. Now, of course, part of this is just the grumpy teenager syndrome. And you've also got social media, declining teen mental health, all of that. But what the report points to is the dramatic step change in satisfaction between primary and secondary school, implying that secondary education plays a big role in this change. More recently, a 2019 OECD report on students' sense of meaning in life, which surveyed 15-year-olds in 79 countries, ranked British schoolchildren next to last among those agreeing with the statement, my life has a clear meaning or purpose, with the General Secretary of the National Association of Head Teachers subsequently complaining of worryingly high percentages of miserable and worried pupils in the UK. Now, there are many reasons for this, but my intuition as a teacher, underpinned in part by the data, tells me that institutional education is, at the very least, an important accessory to their unhappiness. So we can't just continue as we are. So if you are sympathetic to progressive education, I think you can at least apply it lightly. Critical pedagogy, and Paulo Freire specifically, has what I would call a thick and a thin conception. The thick conception is just go with it, wholesale. Accept the world is messed up, teach the students it needs to be reformed, show them that they're oppressed, if you believe it. But don't pretend you're not teaching under the banner of a political ideology. The thin version, on the other hand, is more neutral, it's less overbearing. But it does change the whole way in which the students are taught. Freire's best point really is that education turns on the wheel of dialogue. And research shows that that's true. We don't want an economy of interaction, we want more of it. And this is dialogue, says Freire, supported by action. Students have to do things. If they don't, learning remains abstract and artificial. They need to be in the world, not just look at the world. And also, within this dialogue, you can explore themes that are important to the students. You can link the learning to what's meaningful to them, get them to do projects that they're interested in. So if you're going to achieve this, you need to make space for it. You can try to integrate as much dialogue as possible into your lessons, but ultimately this would need to be a top-down change which radically slims down the curriculum and dispenses with this obsession with content. A lot of teachers, many of my colleagues, always say, there is too much to learn, there's too much to get through. I've heard this from biology teachers to history teachers. And what makes it worse is that when a lot of students get to university, they're often told, right, a lot of that stuff you learned at school, you now need to unlearn it. So curriculum designers need to work out what core things stay in the curriculum and what goes. Lots needs to go. Then you have the space for students not only to talk to you, to each other, but to really explore projects of their own. This was something done, for example, by St George's in the East, a famous free school in London in the 1950s, actually with huge success. The students organised and implemented an enormous range of projects. Investigations into a London clothing factory, the law courts, into London Airport, building complex models of St Paul's Cathedral and Trafalgar Square. These were big, long projects, not just little things. There's a really interesting Times piece on St George's which describes these projects as bringing every child into purposeful and friendly touch with the world, rather than simply observing it and banking it. All the core skills such as maths were of course taught, but the focus of these subjects was on their practical applications and everyday relevance, such as money management. More recent research by Calabrese Barton, focusing on maths, has shown that learning works best and that the students perform best when you don't just teach algebraic equations, but make it real for them, and you show how it can actually improve their lives. And more than that, the students were incredibly involved in the running of St George's. They weren't just passive consumers. They would help to cook the food, run the social clubs. There was a student council that was actually to talk to the staff about the teaching and learning. Now, you might think this would horrify Hannah Arendt, but the teachers weren't without authority. They just involved the students in the school. They made it real for them. And unless you do preserve some teacher authority, true to what Arendt says, you will run into terrible problems. In the White Lion Free School in Islington, for example, they tried an approach that feels very Paulo Freire. They effectively handed authority over to the students, the result of which was that the students basically ran amok. There was bullying, there was vandalism, there was often very little educational value. So you need to be very careful. The teacher does need to be the authority figure. The curriculum needs to be relatively prescriptive. The rules and boundaries need to be clear. But once you've got into that place, then you have a safe space in which real education can grow, in which students can truly thrive, in which they have the chance to become something new, something unforeseen. I hope you enjoyed this video. Just a quick word on what actually qualifies me to talk about education. So I am a teacher. I have over a decade's experience in teaching. I'm a head of department in a big school with, at any given time, about 250 to 300 students under my care. Alongside my teaching qualification, I also have a Master's in Education from University College London. So if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.